I'm David Knowles, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, Ukraine pounds distant Russian air bases, shoots down one of Russia's most expensive fighter jets, and takes hundreds of prisoners as we enter the 9th day of Kyiv's invasion of Russia. We also bring you the latest news from Germany, where authorities have sealed off an army base over suspected sabotage of water supplies.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
The first duty of my government is security and defence, to make clear our unshakable support of NATO and with our allies towards Ukraine.
Kyiv stands strong.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Wednesday, the 14th of August, 2 years and 177 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today I'm joined by our associate editor Dominic Nicholls, assistant comment editor Francis Dearnley, and Berlin correspondent James Rothwell. I started by asking Dom for the latest news from Ukraine and Russia.
Well, hi David, hi team. So, big news today is that a second border region in Russia has declared a state of emergency. This is coming from Vyacheslav Gladkov, governor of Belgorod region to the south of Kursk Oblast. He said this morning the situation in our Belgorod region remains extremely difficult and tense due to shelling from the Ukrainian armed forces. Houses are destroyed, civilians died and were injured. Don't know about the last bit, can't verify any of that, but they've declared a state of emergency. Joe Biden, in his first comments on Ukraine's operations on Russian soil, said yesterday the surprise incursion has created a real dilemma, in his words, for Vladimir Putin. And it's thought about 200,000 Russian civilians are now on the move, having been evacuated from the areas of the fighting. Now, just to reiterate, I've been saying this all week, but I think it's important. It is very, very difficult to verify any information coming out of the region. So please bear with us on that. However, it does seem like Ukraine has kept up the tempo of its operations in Kursk. Authorities in Kyiv say they've made further territorial gains, and Russian forces are reportedly digging trenches nearly 30 miles from the border with Ukraine in the Kursk region. Satellite images have shown hastily dug defensive lines, Russian defensive lines, appearing miles away from Ukraine's current battlefield positions inside Russian territory near the towns of Lvov and Kurchatov. They are both on the main east-west road that comes out of Ukraine, runs through Rilsk, where that strike on Russian reinforcements happened last week. It carries on through Lvov and Kurchatov into Kursk city itself. Those two villages, Lvov, Kurchatov, are about 50 and 60 k's north and sort of north-northeast of Sudza. Now, President Zelensky said last night that Ukrainian forces control 74 localities in Kursk Oblast. I would offer my opinion, we don't know what he means by control. Is that there's a Ukrainian presence? Are they able to deny Russian access to that area, have it under fire control? Are they able to repel counterattacks? We just don't know. He hasn't said. Also, what's a locality? A village, town, collection of houses? We don't know. I offer you the information and then hopefully some sensible analysis to go with it, but I'm afraid it is very, very murky information. President Zelensky also said the ongoing operations continue to grow Ukraine's exchange fund. Again, didn't elaborate, but I'm interpreting that as either or, land or prisoners of war, maybe both. The whole of Kursk region was subjected to air raid alerts on and off for most of last night, Russia's regional governor said this morning. He also said 4 Ukraine-launched missiles had been destroyed overnight. Now, to give you an idea of how difficult it is in trying to work out who's where and what's moving where, the Russian MOD said that they'd repelled Ukrainian attacks near Obshy Kolodezh. That's about 15 k's northeast of Koronovo. Koronovo is the sort of second town of real note, 30 k's northwest of Sudza. So Russian MOD said that they'd repelled Ukrainian attacks near Obshy Kolodezh and also another village called Alexievsky. That's to the northwest of Koronovo. But geolocated footage from yesterday, published by the Institute of Study of War, indicates that Ukrainian forces recently advanced to the northwest and the northeast of Koronovo, and includes specifically a reference to the northeast area or the area northeast of Alexievsky. Now, both of these things could be correct. We know Ukraine has been bypassing areas or some areas of strength. That is a a sensible military tactic if you want to keep up the momentum, keep pushing forward, although obviously it does leave a problem behind you to be dealt with later. In military terms, we call this a meeting engagement. That's when two forces previously unaware of each other come into contact. And it could lead to one side sort of disengaging and moving on, trying to get out of contact and keep the momentum. That could be interpreted as the attack being repelled, which might be correct even before you get into the propaganda side of it. Now, when I was part of 7 Armoured Brigade in the British Army, the Desert Rats, we used to say that in a meeting engagement, the side that decides what to do and acts fastest, usually with very sparse information, is the one that would prevail in a meeting engagement. So, all these things could be correct. When Russian MOD says that they've repelled an attack, that may well be that Ukrainian forces have come up against an area of strong resistance and just bounced off it as best they can to get around the side and keep moving in relative safety. So it's very, very difficult to say from that an attack's been repelled or they're moving on or what have you. So I'll try and give you an idea of how difficult it is to analyse all this. Now, the Russian Milblog community, the military bloggers, the kind of the loudest voices really from this area, and not always completely incorrect, which is why we look at them. They said yesterday that Russian forces had repelled Ukrainian attempts to cross the Kolotilovka border checkpoint in Belgorod. That's about 40 km south of Sudza. There does seem to be a presence down there. Again, I can't say if they have or haven't, but there are reports of Ukrainian forces in the area. The Institute for the Study of War say that Russia may be pulling select elements of Russian irregular units from Donetsk Oblast to push them into Kursk, and may also be redeploying units that were previously intended to relieve or reinforce frontline units from rear areas in Donetsk to Kursk. That view seems to be backed up by the US administration. US officials told the Wall Street Journal yesterday that they've seen this movement of some units from the Donbass and that they are still seeking to determine the significance of these redeployments. They also, the Wall Street Journal didn't say how many troops had been moved. So generally, as far as I can see, there's been no major expansion, as far as I can see, of the area that has been under control of Ukraine in the last few days. Again, with sort of control in bunny ears. Also, no other expansion in the other border areas in Kursk to the west and northwest of Sudza. This morning, Ukraine's general staff said its troops had shot down a Russian Su-34 jet that had been flying a combat mission in Kursk region. That claim was denied by Russia. Alexander Syrsky, the head of Ukraine's armed forces, writing on Telegram, said Ukrainian defence forces destroyed an enemy Su-34. The skies over Kursk region became clearer. Now, Su-34, known NATO terminology as fallback, pretty modern, pretty good, 30 million quid each. That's often used to launch missiles at Ukrainian cities. The downing of that aircraft coincides with other reports that says Ukraine has brought up more air defence systems to the border with Kursk region. So maybe trying to extend that air defence bubble to make it harder for Russia to be able to move with impunity on the ground to try and repel the invasion. Next, in this morning's morning briefing, President Zelensky said Ukraine had captured 100 prisoners of war during the offensive in Kursk so far. He appeared to hint at previously unspecified goals behind this offensive, saying it was, quote, to accelerate the return of our guys and girls home, which, as we said last week, taking of prisoners could well be an aim. Wouldn't have thought it'd be an overriding aim. It's is the juice worth a squeeze? You're going to take prisoners anyway, almost certainly in an offensive action, but to do it for its own ends is quite a big risk. Anyway, Moscow has been on the back foot both militarily and presentationally since the incursion started a week ago. They have come out in the last day or so, on the media front at least, with Russian outlets now calling somewhat obviously Ukrainian soldiers in Kursk terrorists and say they are carrying out human rights abuses. They've accused Ukrainian soldiers of fatally shooting unarmed people and using banned chemical weapons. A headline on the URA.ru website, the URA.ru Russia media website, says the headline is Ukrainian soldiers arrived in Kursk to shoot civilians. Sorry, I shouldn't laugh. They then had an interview with an allegedly captured Ukrainian soldier who claimed he'd been ordered to shoot everybody on the spot. This unfounded allegation was reproduced elsewhere in Russian media. Pro-Kremlin Telegram channels and websites have, without evidence, also accused Ukrainian forces of using banned chemical weapons. The Komsomolskaya Pravda newspaper said Ukrainian Nazis used chemical weapons at the Belovsky district of Kursk region. Now, it should come as no surprise that these stories have started popping up after the Kremlin's National Security Council meeting on Monday, when you may remember Putin was talking about Ukrainian soldiers indiscriminately attacking civilians and civilian infrastructure and threatening nuclear power facilities. I think what's happening here is Russian media are just doing what they know they need to do to survive. They are taking their orders from Monday and off they go. Meanwhile, Russian TV is showing hours of footage designed to boost Russian morale, core messages being that Kyiv's sort of terrorising army is suffering massive casualties and that Russia's troops have stabilised the line and pushed them back. That's the update on the Kursk and Belgorod areas, David. Just to make sense of that, I better take a little pause there.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much, Dom, for talking us through all of that. As you say, a situation that's rapidly evolving. We've been covering it for, I think, basically a week now. So I think it is important just to repeat to our listeners that we try not to report anything until we can really verify it, until we can really give you a good sense of what's going on. But Dom, as you said, there are some other updates from around Russia. Could you talk us through that?
Yeah, sure. Well, let's stay inside Russia. Elsewhere, Ukraine's launched a major drone attack overnight on 3 Russian air bases, all 3 of them hundreds of kilometres inside Russia. The Borisogledsk and Baltimore air bases, both in Voronezh region, are about 250k and 400k respectively, northeast of Kyiv. That gives you an idea. And then the Savoslayka airfield, home to Russian MiG-31s, is about 650k's from the front line. That one's about 200k's east of Moscow. According to local sources, there are at least 10 impacts in the Savoslayka airbase. The MiG-31s there are thought to be the ones carrying the Kinzhal hypersonic missiles that have been launched repeatedly into Ukraine, but showing yet again Ukraine's ability to hit at depth, hit these airfields. And I think all part of the effort in Kursk just to try and seal off that area, let alone stop these missiles and glide bombs and what have you being fired into Ukraine proper. Now, still in Russia, Russia's air defence units destroyed 37 drones from Ukraine overnight that have been targeting the Voronezh region south of Moscow. This comes from Russian MOD speaking this morning. They didn't say how many drones had got through or how many drones had been fired in total. Alexander Gusev, the governor of Voronezh, speaking on Telegraph, said there were no casualties, but that a number of residential homes were damaged. And then back inside Ukraine, there's been little sign of any Russian troop movement to Kursk, or little sign that any troop movement has had a big impact yet. Russian forces advanced slightly near Chasiv Yar, east of Pokrovsk, and also southwest of Donetsk city. But Ukrainian troops also were geolocated as having pushed forward near Siversk, that's further north in the Donbass, and in western Zaporizhia Oblast. And there's a couple more from me. A story from James Kilner. He's been looking at Russian recruitment. He said that Russia will drop prosecutions against people charged with criminal offences if they sign up to fight in Ukraine, the latest Kremlin effort to boost recruitment. News agencies have reported Russia's Supreme Court drafting a law, quote, that allows for the exemption of criminal liability, unquote, for defendants who have entered into a military contract. Now, last month, Moscow city authorities doubled signing on bonuses for men agreeing to fight in Ukraine. We know Russian officials have been pressurising naturalised migrant workers from Central Asia to fight or have their citizenship revoked. Commenting on this, Nigel Gould-Davis, a senior fellow at the IISS, the International Institute for Strategic Studies, said the Russian state has been finding it harder to sustain the call-up rates that it needs for the war. That's why he, Putin, scraped out the prisons. That last reference to prisons was talking about the Wagner Group's program of recruiting from Russian prisons in 2022, a tactic that was adopted more broadly by Russia's MOD the following year. The deal for prisoners was that they could apply for pardon in exchange for a 6-month tour of duty, if they're still alive at the end of it. And whilst no official prison recruitment numbers exist, data from Russia's prison journal show that the population in jail fell last year by 58,000 men. Now, Russian officials had promised that only non-violent prisoners could be freed to serve, but there have been dozens of alleged cases of murderers and rapists being released. Last week, Termilan Eskakhanov, one of the murderers of Russian opposition leader Boris Nemtsov, who was shot dead on the bridge just outside the Kremlin in 2015. He was released to fight in Ukraine. And a government source told the TASS news agency, Russia's state news agency, he, that's Eskakhanov, was assigned to an assault unit and is now carrying out combat missions. The source added that 4 other Chechen men convicted of murdering Nemtsov had declined a pardon in exchange for a stint on the front line. I wonder what made them make their minds up. And that's us up to date, David.
Well, thank you very much, Dom, for all of that. Francis Dearnley, welcome back to the podcast. I hope you had a restful and recuperative time off. You've been looking at some international reaction to the assault on Kursk, and you've been coming up with some of your own analysis. Francis.
Thanks, David. It's good to be back on and what feels like one of the most significant weeks of the war for many, many months. Kyiv has now seized more territory in Russia than the Kremlin has since the start of the year in Ukraine. As I said before, sometimes being detached from the granular detail for a few days can be a helpful exercise, as it allows one to see what stories are receiving cut through and how they're being interpreted by others not following the war as intimately as we are, and that includes many politicians. Sometimes in politics, as in many other professions, the more one knows, the less one knows, and one can suffer paralysis by analysis. We, as people following this closely, are obliged, of course, to be cautious in our interpretations of what may or may not be happening in the coming days and weeks. Many experts are still wary of what this could mean for resources available to Ukraine's own front lines. But regardless, it would be wrong not to take this moment to really underline the staggering achievement by Kyiv in terms of shifting perceptions of this war, at least temporarily. This incursion has clearly got enormous cut-through. It's the lead story around the world and, more importantly, is being interpreted as an enormous Ukrainian success, not least on the home front. That matters for all the reasons that will be obvious to you listening at home. Fundamentally, it is about politics, as Sir Alexander Younger, the former head of MI6, put it on the BBC this morning. Zelensky had both to reset the conversation before November and reset the idea of cost in Putin's mind, namely the cost of a longer war for him and for his rule. For there's no net reason now to think the Ukrainians wouldn't be capable of similar embarrassments in the future. Indeed, only today, Russia's special envoy has said that Kyiv has put the issue of peace talks with Russia on a long pause by attacking Kursk. A clear indication would be hard to find of just how much Moscow's hand has been weakened by this attack. More importantly, it will lead to a reassessment by many Western leaders of what is capable of after its failed counteroffensive last year. As President Biden put it earlier, and as quoted by Dom, this has created a real dilemma for Putin. On multiple fronts, the more Putin talks about this, the more it underlines his own weakness. The more resources he pulls away from other fronts to tackle it, which it would appear he might be about to do, the weaker the pressure becomes on those fronts where gains were being made. Western leaders are seeing this play out in real time. What we don't know yet is the degree of foreknowledge those leaders had of this attack. Donald Tusk, Poland's Prime Minister, said that Ukraine has the right to counter Russian aggression as effectively as possible. Finland's Prime Minister and Estonia's have also waded in and said that they support the operations that are being conducted, with the latter saying that he wished them good luck. But who knew in advance? Another snippet from Biden's remarks, which seemed to have not really been picked up much, is he said that Washington had been in constant contact with Kyiv since the operation began. The fact that there was no palpable sense of alarm from Western governments since the incursion may suggest that more was known in advance than has been speculated. That's one for PhD students listening to this in 50 years' time when the archives are opening. The reason I focus on that is, given the nuclear escalation argument, one could easily have imagined a scenario where one might have seen panic among Western governments. That there hasn't been is interesting and in and of itself a remarkable development. It would appear that in one foul swoop, Kyiv has seriously damaged the credibility of Putin's nuclear escalation, his trump card, as it were. For if not an invasion sparking threats of its use, what can? It will now seem to many that it was never a credible deterrent in this regard. So an important development, David, once underscores something else that we've been saying on this podcast for many months now, that in war, nothing is predictable. It cannot simply be measured in terms of logistics. Some critics are pointing to this incursion and saying that it's just like the German counterattack during the Battle of the Bulge. Like that battle, it will change nothing because of the logistical advantage they perceive Russia as having. Just for those who aren't familiar, Battle of the Bulge, an early success for the Germans, but once the Allies brought their force to bear, their logistics to bear, it changed nothing for the direction of travel of the conflict. Now, that may be true in that scenario of the Second World War, but the objective of this incursion is fundamentally different. It is not designed to push Russian forces all the way back. It has a set purpose, predominantly political, which it has arguably already achieved. The major question now is what Ukraine will do next. Do they intend to hold the territory long term, using it as a bargaining chip in negotiations, or do they conduct an orderly withdrawal now that the point has been made? There is, of course, a risk that Russia launches an operation and is able to successfully claim a victory after this, switching the narrative once again away from success to one of failure for Kyiv. But there are still risks, even of doing that. For now, I think it's fair to say that this has been a triumph of military strategy for Kyiv. And in that vein, I just wanted to round up this segment with a quotation plucked from Clausewitz by Jonathan R. Hunt, Assistant Professor of Strategic Deterrence at the US Naval College. That quote from Clausewitz: "Defence is simply the more effective form of war, a means to win a victory that enables one to take the offensive after superiority has been gained. That is, to proceed to the active objective of the war." Now, if that is true in this scenario, it will lead to a reassessment of the operations conducted by Kyiv in recent months. It will be less of a holding on desperately than a deliberate action to hold the line whilst they were preparing for this offensive operation that has struck hugely effectively and surprisingly into Russia. So, as I say, reassessments all the time once we know the truth of what is really going on. That is the reality of war and indeed of history being shaped. Now, the active objective of the war, to use that quote from Clausewitz there, remains in flux, but I would posit this has strengthened the position of those who believe that an outright Ukrainian victory militarily is possible were Kyiv to receive the support it has pleaded for ever since the conflict began. And that shift in and of itself has the potential to be hugely significant over the coming weeks and months. So the question remains, will this open minds and wallets? Remains to be seen, but a decisive development.
Thank you very much, Francis Dearnley, for all of that. James Rothwell, welcome back. It's good to have you back on the podcast so soon after your last appearance. There's quite a few updates to speak through from Germany itself. Where would you like to start?
Thanks, David. So let's begin with the news this morning that Germany has issued an arrest warrant for a Ukrainian citizen who's suspected of involvement in the 2022 attack on the Nord Stream gas pipeline. Interesting story, this. It was brought forward by a conglomerate of investigative newspapers and broadcasters, ARD, Süddeutsche Zeitung, and Die Zeit. And they have confirmed that in June, an arrest warrant was issued for a Ukrainian man named Volodymyr Z, which I think we can only presume is not the Volodymyr Z that we're all thinking of. It is, we presume, someone else. But I will add that this is a slightly strange story for reasons that I'll get into now. The arrest warrant was issued, and then a request was transferred to Poland to arrest this individual there because German officials believed that he was, as it were, hiding out in Warsaw. No arrest took place, and it appears that the suspect has now left Poland and may be back in Ukraine, which has raised some questions as to why this suspect wasn't arrested at the time. It was a European arrest warrant. Germany and Poland obviously are committed to carrying those out. So there's more things that we don't know than things that we do know about this story. This afternoon, there's been another update on that story. After some criticism by Germany of Poland for not fulfilling the arrest warrant, Poland has now put out a statement to the news agency Reuters saying that it's not their fault that they arrested this suspect in Poland because Germany failed to include his name in a database of wanted persons. And as a result of that, basically nobody seems to know where this Ukrainian citizen actually is. Now, according to the reporting this morning in German media, this was a guy who allegedly was working in tandem with some other Ukrainian suspects, and allegedly they were on a Germany-flagged yacht in the approximate area of the Nord Stream pipeline when the explosion takes place. I should stress that we don't really know who carried out this attack. It's never been confirmed, and there's various theories floating around. But the fact that the German government has issued an arrest warrant is arguably the strongest step forwards in terms of identifying a suspect. And I should also add, by the way, that the German media reporting suggests that even though this guy was Ukrainian, there's no suggestion yet, at least, that the Ukrainian government or Ukrainian military was involved. So in summary, there's been a significant development in the investigation into the Nord Stream attack. An arrest warrant has been issued for one Volodymyr Z, but no one in Europe seems to know where he is. And until they do, assuming he's even still in the European Union, it's going to be quite tricky for them to detain that individual for questioning. So that's the first big story from Germany today. And there's also been quite an interesting story in relation to a German military barracks in Cologne, which I can elaborate on for you. Basically, the German army has had to lock down a military barracks near Cologne airport. They confirmed that this afternoon. Why has it been locked down? Well, according to Spiegel, a German magazine, there's been a sabotage attack on the barracks, which appears to have contaminated the water supply. Soldiers on the base have been told not to touch the drinking water, to not allow anyone in or out of the barracks, and to keep an eye out for any suspicious behaviour. There's a suggestion there, perhaps, that the person who carried out this sabotage might still be on the premises. Some speculation in German media, too, that whoever this person was, broke into the base in order to essentially poison the drinking water. We don't know what that means exactly, whether it means that the water is very dangerous to drink, potentially deadly, or whether they've done something else to the water which just renders it unsafe in general. Why are we talking about this on the Ukraine podcast? Well, as our listeners know, there's been this hybrid war campaign waged by Russia for many months now, which is trying to target key infrastructure in Europe. We touched on that theme yesterday in terms of the Åland Islands and the Baltic Sea, and being on the lookout for spies trying to cut cables. But we've seen a lot of incidents like this in Germany where Russia is suspected. For example, there was the arrest in April of 2 German-Russian citizens who are accused of plotting to attack a military site in Bavaria that assists Ukrainian forces. And there was, of course, that rather infamous now fire at an arms factory in Berlin, which German police initially wrote off as an accident. But they've since been warned by a NATO ally, we don't know which one, that it was a deliberate sabotage attack by Russia. So we're waiting to see today and in the coming days whether the German government or the army may identify a suspect in this sabotage. And I'd also stress that there have been a few cases over the last few months where something that seems very suspicious like this has happened. And because of heightened geopolitical tensions, officials may have speculated, that one country or another is involved, but it may turn out that this was an accident. Although, as I said earlier, the German media reporting, which is based on sources in the army, does suggest that this was a deliberate sabotage attack. Another one potentially to hit Germany, which is embarrassing for their security services at a time where they're battling with leaks and other attempts to sort of destabilize German democracy. So I think this barracks story is one to follow. Perhaps we can revisit it later in the week if we get some more information on what actually happened. But it does appear to be another concerning security breach for the German military establishment.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much, James, for talking us through those stories. One more piece from you, I think. You spoke to Elina Valtonen, Finland's foreign minister, on your recent trip. You talked about it yesterday, your trip to the Åland Islands, but also to Finland. What did she tell you, and what does this mean for Ukraine and Russia?
Yes, that's right. So I was in Helsinki last week doing an interview with Elina Valtonen, the Finnish foreign minister. And one of the topics that came up in our interview was the role that Finland might play in any potential future peace negotiations led by America and Russia. Now, our slightly older listeners will think of Helsinki as a very important city in the context of peace accords, diplomacy, and negotiations. This was the venue for the Helsinki Accords in 1975. And it was the venue for a very significant, at the time, summit between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin in 2018. This obviously happened years before the war, years before the collapse in US-Russian relations. And back then, it was a moment for Trump and Putin to pledge some cooperation on areas where they had some common ground at the time in terms of cybersecurity and in terms of terrorism. And the question was put to the Finnish foreign minister, would you be interested in hosting a similar Putin-Trump summit if Mr. Trump is re-elected in the United States? And she completely ruled it out. She said, like almost anybody in Europe, we don't have any political dialogue with Russia at the moment, and we're not looking to open any dialogue either for as long as Russia keeps invading sovereign nations in its neighborhood. And that's significant because what it means is that this city of diplomacy, which has a strong reputation for securing these peace accords, has basically said, its government has said, that it doesn't want to essentially help Mr. Trump to kind of sell a peace deal on Ukraine for two reasons. One, they don't think that Russia will negotiate in good faith at this stage and probably won't in the near future. But two, I think it makes the Finnish position pretty clear in terms of where it sits on this. Finland has recently joined NATO. As we know, it's playing a bigger role in European security, and it's a very close ally of Ukraine. And it doesn't want to be seen to be lending its seal of approval to any kind of negotiations or summits, which is kind of heavily weighted against Ukraine's favour and which isn't based on the only, as the Finns put it, serious peace proposal that's been put forward so far. And when they say that, they're referring to President Zelensky's own plan. So don't look to Finland, basically, for any peace summits in the near future. According to the Finnish foreign minister, not going to be a repeat of that 2018 summit, which was deemed by many to be so successful at the time. And that, I think, illustrates the kind of, could even say, more hawkish role that Finland is starting to play in European foreign policy at the moment. And it speaks to a wider theme with Finland and the Baltic region, really. And this is why I was on the Baltic Sea on the Åland Islands last week for this reporting trip. The Baltic states are going to be so important in terms of deciding the future of European security. We've got Finland and Sweden in NATO now. These two countries, yes, they're quite small, but they're very nimble, they're very vigilant, and they are going to be invaluable, I think, in the years to come in terms of setting large swathes of defence policy. And so when they speak up in interviews like this, I think it's always worth hearing what they have to say.
Coming up, we hear Francis, James and Dom's final thoughts. Let's move then to our final thoughts. Francis Dearnley, would you like to go first?
Well, thanks, David. Just a very brief one from me. Keep an eye on the ruble. It's been quite remarkable the last couple of days seeing the dents that this has taken at various percentage points as a consequence of the shock. But that was just the initial shock. If Ukraine is able to hold on to this territory for longer, then expect the ruble to suffer even more. And on that subject, we're going to have our economics editor on the podcast tomorrow to dive deeper into exactly what has happened in the Russian economy as a ramification of this. Now, we've had lots of false dawns with regard to weakness in the Russian economy, and I'm not suggesting that this will be a turning point, but it remains an open question just how severely damaged the Russian economy is by this conflict. And I would posit that serious shocks will have more ramifications than one might expect when you have an economy that is built on very shaky foundations, which of course any economy is, that is built on basically mass expenditure to keep afloat, which is exactly what Putin has relied upon. So watch this space, and certainly return tomorrow. We'll be looking at that into further detail.
Thank you so much, Francis. It's really good to have you back. James Rothwell, can I come to you next?
I will substitute my final thought for an update from German media on the military bases, which I should probably get writing on immediately, actually, which is that Bild newspaper reports that a second military base, this one in Gelsenkirchen, has also been closed down over concerns of contaminated drinking water. One person has been arrested in connection with that closure, Bild reports, and that means basically that two German military bases on the same day appears to have been sabotaged, which is a significant story and one which I should probably get working on now so I can file some copy to my editors. So on that note, thanks all, and speak to you again soon.
Thank you very much for joining us, James, and good luck. We look forward to reading your reporting later. Dom Nicholls, would you like to share your final thoughts?
Yeah, thanks, David. And I've got a little bit of an update as well as James. So in the last few minutes, It's been reported General Alexander Syrsky, the head of Ukraine's armed forces, has said, quote, "The search and destruction operation of the enemy forces in the city of Sudza has been completed," end quote. There's no more details, but I'm interpreting that as being that they are now confident that Sudza is under Ukrainian control. I don't think when he says it's completed, that means they're off, but we don't know. We will see, obviously, as news continues to come in over the next day. But I mentioned that it actually does tie in with my final thought. I just wanted to pause for a moment, if we may. We're a week in now to this invasion, whatever we're going to call it. The rapid advance of Ukraine's forces has slowed, although there's little sign of them meeting firm resistance yet. Questions we still don't know. Will Russia pound its own soil? Is Russia going to start using glide bombs on its own territory? That would be a very, very interesting development if they do that. If not, what else have they got? How else are they going to push these guys out without taking huge amounts of heavy metal away from the Donbass or elsewhere? We shall see. Now, if they're not going to do that on their own soil and it's going to take time to redeploy forces, that might buy some time for Ukraine? Is it enough time to get to the Rasputitsa, the muddy season in the autumn, when pretty much all movement stops? I don't know. For my money, I want Ukraine's forces to stay there. I want them to take more territory. I want them to march on Moscow. I want them to end this thing. But realistically, is that going to happen? However, the one thing Ukraine cannot afford right now is to lose lots of fighters and equipment and lose the idea that's lodged for now in minds in Moscow, Washington, Beijing, elsewhere, that they can do this, and they can do this again and again and again. Russia's actions have been shown to have consequences and cost. That thought alone, if Ukraine remain in good order, that thought alone will pay dividends in any future negotiations. But it will not survive a rout if Ukraine was pushed out, in bad order. So I still think it's likely that they will aim at some point, and importantly, a point, a time, a place of Ukraine's own choosing, to get out intact, in good order. Now, that will, of course, be played out by Moscow as a stunning victory, but those that know what's really going on, and I include us in that, you and us, the team here, and everyone listening to this, Team Onions, we know better than that. Okay, so don't worry when it happens. It's already started, but don't worry when it happens. We get the usual tired propaganda rubbish from the Kremlin. The more they talk about this incursion, Russian media, the Kremlin directly, Putin, the more they talk about it, even if it's through the lens of having defeated Ukraine and shoved them off, the more we all know that they've been hurt by it. Now, this has been, I'm not going to deny it, a huge emotional boost for those of us who want Ukraine to win this war and who've been, labouring for months now, years, under the weight of the big black cloud. We've felt that. The team here talk about it regularly. If you feel it, if you felt it, you are not alone. It's not a sign of weakness. It's called humanity. But I think we should prepare ourselves for the prospect of Ukraine returning to its lines. We don't need to worry about that if it's done properly. As I say, that is not defeatist. It's an effort to build resilience and smooth out the emotional roller coaster. But even if they do return to Ukraine, I think we should take heart that they have been on this madcap adventure that has infuriated and more importantly, rattled Putin. And I would say he's done more to boil his borscht than any supply of arms could ever do. So let's just work on our resilience, folks. Keep talking to each other. We're all in this together. And I love the fact that there are some very ugly people having their cages rattled right now.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Or sign up to Dispatches, our Ukraine newsletter, which brings stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a Ukraine live blog on our website where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so you don't miss it. To our listeners on YouTube, please note that due to issues beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload, So if you want to hear Ukraine the Latest as soon as it is released, do refer to podcast apps. If you enjoyed this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app. And if you have a moment, leave a review, as it helps others find the show. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do read every message. And you can contact us directly on Twitter. You can find our Twitter handles in the description for this episode. Ukraine the Latest is produced by Louisa Wells and Giles Gear.